Hello and aloha, and welcome aboard History 241, Civilizations of Asia, session 23rd, which would deal today with ancient Japan from about 300 BC to 600 AD. My name is Abdul Karim Khan. I teach here at Leeward Community College. Please go to WebCT and check out any assignments that might be coming. As well as note down my latest phone number and the email address and contact me whenever you want to. And I would hopefully get back to you as soon as I can. So today we are going to be dealing with ancient Japan. But before we get into that, we need to see what we did last time. And so by way of sort of a review, last time we talked about the Mongol Empire and even we finished the Mongol Empire. So let's see what we did last time. In review, we talked about the division of the Mongol Empire and how, after the death of, especially death of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan, how his sons and grandsons went their own ways and divided the empire. The major piece in the Mongol Empire that we talked about was in the Middle East under Hulagu Khan. Another major piece of the empire was in the East, in the Far East, and that was in China and Mongolia and most of China under Kublai Khan. And then we talked about, the Western people, Europeans coming to China, and especially we mentioned Marco Polo in China, and how he and his family and others were the sort of evidence, the East-West trade and travel that went on the Silk Road at that time. So the Mongols, I said, made it possible for the Western European people to come and do business with the Chinese, and in between anybody could do that. And then how, within 100 years, Mongols, a minority, ruling minority, how they were assimilated in the people among whom they were living in the Middle East and China and in between, and that, finished them. And in fact, that brought the Mongol Empire down. The assimilation of the Mongol people in the local people in the regions that they were ruling. So they became, they were rulers, Mongols, but they became, one of the people that they were ruling. So they adopted, their religion, they adopted their languages, they married, locally, so they became one of them, and that's how, by assimilation, they lost, the power that they had been, controlling or having for the past 100 years. Some Mongols became completely, Sinicized Chinese. Those who were living in the West among the Muslim people, the Arab people, they became Arabs. They could not speak their Mongol language. They would have to speak Arabic and live among the Arabs, so they became Arabs and part, of the Arab civilization. So that was the Mongol Empire. We would visit the Mongol Empire one more time in the history of Japan later on, not in this session. It's too early for that. So right now we would go into the Japanese civilization, how Japan started as a culture, as a nation, as people, and how they developed their own history and identity and civilization. So let's see what we have today in session 23rd about Japan. All right. By way of introduction, we would talk first about the geography of Japan, and then the people of Japan, and we would see the rise of settled agriculture life, and then the ancient history of Japan. And here I should remind you, when we say ancient history, that means prehistory, history before writing in Japan. We would also talk about the society in the Yamato Plains. I would explain that, what it means, the Yamato Plains. The religion in Japan, especially Shintoism, how it started in Japan. And then, let's go into the geography of Japan and see how the place identified itself or became the identity of the people of Japan. Japan locally, or in Japan, referred to as Nihon or Nippon throughout the history, even today, Nihon and Nippon, and it literally means the land of the rising sun. And as you know from the world map, the islands that make Japan, they are in the extreme east of everybody. I mean, especially Asian continent. So since they are in the east, and that's why the people of Asia are also referring to them, that the sun, the place where the sun rises. But the Japanese, as the sun disk itself became, sort of an emblem, national emblem on their flag. And they've been using it, way before Second World War. And so that sun, the Japanese also identified themselves with the sun, that they were the first country up there in the east, and the sun rose upon them first. That sort of a pride. Also, the sun goddess, the goddess that controlled the sun, also became a part of the religion and even part of the politics, that we would see how, sun goddess was used in the genealogy of the rulers or the elites or the emperors in Japan. So hence the importance of that location being the place where the sun rises upon east or whoever, in the world, and hence land of the rising sun. Let's see. Japan lies to the east of China and Korea. It is part of East Asia, as we call it, and East Asian countries, China, Korea, and Japan. The three major countries. You could also include Taiwan in the list, but these are the three major countries called East Asia. Some people just refer to them as Asia, but then when you say Asia, just these three countries, you are missing a lot, so that's why East Asia. Next, let's see the four major islands that make Japan, the geography. Hokkaido up in the north, closer to Russia and Siberia. Then Honshu, the bigger island in the middle, or that makes, the whole of almost Japan. And then Shikoku, a small one, but still very important. And the last one, Kyushu in the southwest. And let's see the whole of Japan there. And so these four major islands from east to north, northeast to southwest, and very close to this is Korea. This is China. Up there would be Russia. Up here would be also, the Siberian section of Russia, Eastern Russia or Asiatic Russia as they call it, Siberia. And some of these islands up here in the northeast of Japan, these are still disputed islands, but they are in control of Russia because they seized it in the Second World War. One time, in 1989 and 1990, the Japanese offered the Russians to buy them. Japan would buy these islands from Russia, but the Russian did not agree to it. So keep in mind that these islands are disputed, but they are part of Russia now. Let's see. One by one, the islands, Hokkaido, Honshu, the third one, Shikoku, and the fourth one, Kyushu. So these four major islands make Japan. Now, so far, as you can see it, compared to China, the big country in the West, mainland China, Japan is very small. However, the present day conditions, or since Second World War or a little bit before Second World War, the Japanese somehow, although they were smaller in geography and smaller in population, but that also gave them a sort of deliberate identity that we are as superior as anybody could be. So what if we have small population, a small piece of geography, small land, notwithstanding that smallness of the land and the people, we are as great as anybody can be, and that's how somehow went into the national political psyche of the Japanese people, which later on would create a lot of problems, not only for the Japanese, but also for the neighbors, even China. And so they would try to, grab certain parts in China, especially Manchuria, and that would make it a little bit, the problem between China and Japan later on as we would go into History 242. So let's see further in today's presentation. Geography of Japan. About 70 to 80% Japan is mountains and forest, and that just takes a lot of land from Japan. It seems like there's nothing but mountains, and these mountains, small mountains, not huge and big like the Himalayas, small mountains, but still, they take a lot of space, as well as the forest. That makes it, these two features, mountains and forests, a beautiful country. But, people don't eat beauty, they need food. So that has been, always a problem in the society, in the history of Japan. So a lot of mountains, a lot of forest, dense forest. This is, by the way, Mount Fuji. It's a NASA picture from space. And look at this, the crater, right at the tip of it. And so there is the snow, of course, and so this is Mount Fuji from space looking, from high up down on Mount Fuji. That does not diminish, the beauty of Mount Fuji and, its role in the geography and the psyche of the people of Japan. So a lot of mountains and a lot of forest, as I said. Most of Japan made of volcanic activities. So even today, there are, and as you know, from news, there is always a major earthquake, once in 3 or 4 years. The last one in Kobe killed a lot of people. So, but that's, they have resigned to the fact that if they live in Japan, they have to, live with these earthquakes. So a lot of volcanic activities, and that, creating its own craters and beauty, but they could be very dangerous to the population. All right. Japan also is part of what is called, the rising sun. And so here, the ring of fire, right there, sort of a ring of fire. And so this area is very prone to the volcanic activities, in the world. And so there are major earthquakes in this area, of the world, in this part of the world. And so that's why this is called the ring of fire, because of too much volcanic activity, too many earthquakes, and at the same time, too many casualties. But still, people live there. If you ask them, move away, go somewhere else, they don't, because that's their home. And we understand that, but they pay a big price of the living in the ring of fire. All right, let's see further. Geography of Japan. Because of the too many forests and the too many, mountains, there are about 13%. The 13% land could be brought under cultivation. So that the 13% arable land could be brought by 1990, and that is with all this gadget, motorized and mechanized agricultural machinery, bulldozers and tractors and whatnot, and fertilizers. So keep in mind that is, a small portion of the land, 13%. But that's why, agriculture is the cultivation is so intensive. They force like the ground or the earth or the soil to produce bumper crops with fertilizer and so many chemicals, like almost every year to produce 2 or 3 bumper crops, and that's just like killing. The soil must be begging the farmers, don't feed me with all this poison fertilizer, but they need food, so they have to do that. Speaking of, especially in ancient Japan, Japanese people in ancient time, they suffered a lot from mass starvation, lack of food. There were these, traditions in certain parts of Japan where food was very, minimum. So the older generation, the old people, in a certain community or locality, they would be taken to, as they, became very old, infirm, couldn't do anything, and they were just about to die in maybe in 2 or 1 year. They were taken to the mountain top, although with a lot of respect and reverence and pomp and show and drumming and all that stuff, dancing. So they would be taken to the mountain top, and there they would be left to die. And the idea was to save their food for the younger generation, the infants, the babies, and that was the whole idea. One time, Kurosawa, he made a movie on it, and people didn't like it because now they have self-sufficiency. But he was just reminding them, this is part of our culture, this is part of our history, ancient history, that we did not have much food, and we had this, hunger for land, and that's why we got into so much trouble with each other. So a lot of fighting that we would go into. This presentation, the next one, lack of food, lack of land, played its negative role in the society of Japan. And one was, right now they're self-sufficient in food, no question about that. But at the same time, they have to, beat the ground and feed the ground with so much, fertilizer and chemicals, that only that would be possible for the land to produce 2 crops in 1 year. Let's see further. So keep in mind the 13%, land that can be brought under cultivation. Whatever agriculture sector is there, especially rice, that is highly protected, in the sense protected from foreign competition. The American rice growers, they would love to sell their rice on world market, prices, but the Japanese farmers, they don't want that, the American rice. Although the people of Japan, they would love to eat, American rice. To some, they look, it tastes better if they can get it. I'm not really very good fan of rice, to tell you the truth. I like bread, my bread, back from home, if I can get it. But the Japanese government, it protects the rice cultivation and the rice cultivators and the industry, agriculture industry in Japan from foreign competition. So that's why they would not let foreign rice, especially from United States. They do allow some, maybe a certain percentage of rice would be allowed to come in Japan, because they do not, want to, the farmers to get discouraged and abandon, in a domestic cultivation of rice and be completely dependent upon American rice or somebody else rice, that is rice importation. So they don't want to do that. Let's see, what else? The government also pays subsidies, just like here in the United States, the government pays subsidies to people, to do agriculture, because they cannot fight foreign, competition. So government subsidizes a lot rice, just like some farmers here in this country, in the United States, they want the government to pay them, for the losses due to import of food, tomatoes, etc., from down south, from Latin America, so that they cannot, cope with. Here, the labor is very costly, and down, in the south, it's not. So that's why, they can bring cheaper agriculture goods to United States, and so the American farmer, they don't like it, and so they get subsidies, from Congress. And if you are a congressman from Iowa or somewhere, Midwest, you better fight for your, states to get maximum financial support for your farmers from the Congress every year in the budget. And so that's how the Japanese government subsidizes the rice cultivators in Japan, so that they could stand, on their feet and, grow rice and protect it from foreign competition. Let's see further. The geohistorical comparison between England and Japan. Before we get into, Japanese history, I thought I should let you know that even Japanese historians, they love to compare Japan here with England right there. as Japan is in the extreme east of East Asia, England is in the extreme west of Western Europe. Here is Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and so both are island nations as you see it. So we brought, the world together, in a way, a complete Eurasia. This is Asia, this is Western Europe. I just wanted to show you, how Japan is in the extreme east of everybody and how England is in the extreme west of everybody. So let's see further what is that comparison about. And the Japanese scholars themselves, they like it, that comparison. Both are island nations as you know it, and both suffer from lack of land, small countries, although Japan is bigger than England, both produced military classes for that reason, lack of land, and the military classes, in fact, they produce their own codes. The military class in England and rest of Europe, especially in England, called the knights, and their code is called the chivalry, unwritten code, but still very much in use. And in Japan, the military class, the warrior class, the samurai, they have their own code by which they live. We will talk about that later on, called Bushido, the code of samurai, Bushido, by which they, honor and live. In both countries, history started late. Civilization first had to start on the mainland in both cases, and it was from the mainland that history moved, to the fringes from China into, from East Asia into Japan, and from Western Europe into England, in the West. So the beginning of history was late. Somebody had to come from the mainland, to settle and start culture, start civilization, and of course, along with that, start the history in the two countries. Let's see further about the geohistorical comparison between England and Japan. Both had sort of a love-hate relationship with their continental neighbors. Japan, had problem with China. England had problem with, Spain and France and other nations. Both, in fact, adopted the writing script. The Japanese adopted that from, from Chinese, and the British, the Englishmen, they adopted from, Latin script that was so prevalent and used on continental Europe. Both adopted their neighbor's religion. England adopted Christianity because it was already there in the continent, European continent, and the Japanese adopted because, especially Buddhism and Confucianism, because it was already in there in China. Both became very imperialistic. And so they turned imperialistic, which means both wanted to bring other nations under their control, and both made big empires. Japan made empire in Asia, and England made empire everywhere. They both influenced, their local people in a different way. The influences, of course, of England, huge and big. Particularly the influence of English, which is, a universal language. Whether some people like it or not, it's a universal language. I come from, the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and speaking Pashto mother tongue. But the first major I did was in English, British literature. So it's a dominant, powerful language, throughout the world. The French may not like it, but yet it is, a worldwide language, universal language. However, the Japanese language very much confined to Japan, and those people who want to do business with Japan would have to speak and learn it, to speak it. But the Japanese influence would be much more, as it is, we see it today, in technology. And electronic, as we call it, the electronic tribe, Japan. So they have their own influence, So they both influence people in a different way, one through language, the other through technology. Automobiles, as you see so many of them. You don't see Jaguars, the British, the English, cars on the American roads, but you see so many Toyotas and Hondas here. Okay, let's see further. Now, the people of Japan. Let's see who are the Japanese people, by origins. And this has been a classic problem, a big problem, or it used to be at least, before 1960s. And the problem was the Japanese themselves would ask themselves a question, who are we as nation, as people, as a race? A big question. Unfortunately, there is not much of evidence to find out. Lack of ancient archaeology. Archaeology is not there. And the reason is because of the acidic volcanic soil. As I said, Japan is made of too many volcanic activities, and there is a lot of acidity in the soil, and that acidity eats up human and animal bones. So that's why, we don't have too many like fossils, human fossils, to do some DNA testing or compare them, the bones with some other people to find out, who were the original people of Japan or the aborigines, so to speak, of Japan. So that's one problem. Another thing is we even don't know, what animals came first to Japan and settled there or lived there, made Japan their home. And the reason again is because the acidity in the soil ate up these animal and human bones. So if you're looking for dinosaur in Japan, that would be a wrong place because they're not there, or maybe they were there, but their bones or fossils, could not be preserved again because of the acidity in. So that's why it's a big problem. And these days, if somebody finds a bone in Japan, it becomes instantly a national news because that bone can prove that human beings or mammals lived in Japan, like centuries or 1,000 years before what we assume or presume now, before the presumption, the current presumptions. So that bone can push Japanese history a few centuries or 1,000 years back into history to say, we were here, back then, we're not new people here to the islands. So that's why archaeology is very important because it is a bit lacking in Japan. And the reason I said was the acidic soil. Let's see. Japanese have been claiming that they are the original people, and so they refer to themselves as the Yamato people. So that would be like in China, the Han people would be the real Chinese. So the Yamato people would be the real Japanese. The Yamato people are the real Japanese. But beside the Yamato people, the real Japanese, there came a lot of Koreans from Korea, throughout centuries history. And there were the Aborigines, the local people, Ainu, that called Ainu, and especially people in Okinawa and a couple of other ethnic groups that were discriminated in Japan a lot. Ainus were discriminated, the Okinawans as well as the Koreans. But these were one of those, first groups that were there in Japan as the Japanese people were starting their culture, their civilization, and their history. This became a big problem, unfortunately, in close to about 1920s and 30s, when Japan was rising as a great power at the end of the First World War. And then, all these different theories, race theories that started, especially in Europe and particularly in the 1930s, among the Germans, this Nazi party, a very racist, party, and hating people, it was not so much the love of their own race, it was just the hatred of other people. And that type of a racism started in Germany, and so it affected people also, these extreme nationalists in Japan that were pure blue-blooded, Japanese, we are the original people, this and that, and discriminating, the minorities that lived there, especially the Ainu people, and a lot of them were killed, back even in 1880s, 1890s, and very much discriminated. Similarly, the Koreans were discriminated and looked down upon. So in 1930s, nobody could tell, a Japanese person, hey, if you scratch your Japanese skin, you might find a lot of Korean blood, inside yourself. Nobody could say that because those were the time of extreme nationalism. But now more and more Japanese realize and they admit, yes, we are a mixed group of people from Korea, from Ainu, the Aborigines who lived here, and we the Japanese, we are mixed people, and a lot of people also came from China. So now that's looked upon as a good thing, multiculturalism, that sort of stuff. So we are now a mixed people, we are not a pure blue-blooded people unmixed with anybody else. So that's a race dimension is going down, which is good for everybody. Let's see further. The people of Japan. This is the particular group of Ainu that I was talking about, and as you can see, they're very hairy people and, big beards, which, the East Asian people, China, Japan, and Korea, cannot have, such a huge big beard, and especially these two gentlemen, the older people, keeping beard, just like beard in the Middle East or Mediterranean area or any other area. India could be Pakistan, some of the Aborigines, they look like very hairy, very bushy, and believe it or not, there were people in Japan, especially up north in Hokkaido, people who look like people of Siberia, some of them Caucasian-looking people, but those were, they disappeared or they were made to disappear. So that's why there is a mixture of group of people that we now call them Japanese. So this particular group of people were the Ainu. Let's see further. Ancient Japan. So now we're getting into sort of the beginning of culture and civilization, and then later on history. Close to about 30,000 BC, mammals and human beings starting arriving, especially from Northeast Asia. Some from Korea, China, but a lot of them from Siberia, from modern-day Siberia, Northeast Asia. By about 10,000 BC, you see in Japan, in the islands, these finely shaped stone tools, so which tells us that this is, about a Neolithic stage, the new stone stage in Japan, 10,000 BC. The pottery that they made at this early period, 10,000, that's why it's called the world's oldest pottery. Now here, at 10,000 BC, two things are happening, and they're very, very interesting. Two things. Number one, 10,000 BC in Japan. 10,000 BC in Japan is referred to as a Neolithic stage, by which we mean that Japanese people still did not know, or in the Neolithic age, people did not know how to do agriculture. Like people still living in caves or wherever, they did not make their structure, their homes, things like that. So 10,000 BC in Japan was the Neolithic age, but by this time in other civilizations, by 10,000 BC, they had already left the Neolithic age and they were entering into real historic period, and some places like reading and writing, coming along. So that's why, some people say like, while the Japanese people were still learning how to do agriculture, other nations were flying rockets. That may be a little bit exaggeration, but that just gives you a sense how late the Japanese people started history, culture, and civilization. But once they started, boy, that is just like a boom. They started with a big bang, and they almost, left everybody behind. So we would see that. So that's why by 10,000 BC, the pottery that they had, that is the oldest in world history. And that could be one reason, because there were people, a lot of people, we don't know of them. We don't know about their culture. We don't know about, the beginning of life in Japan. So that's why the existence of pottery means the surplus of food, the preservation of food. And so only those societies produce pottery, those cultures, community produce pottery, who could do more agriculture, who could produce more food, and they need to preserve. That's why they needed to invent pottery, and that's what was happening in Japan in about 10,000 BC. Let's see further. By 8,000 BC, you see the rise of what is called Jomon culture. And Jomon pottery, because this type of pottery was cord pattern, and you see the pattern of the cord around the household utensil, the pottery, and so because of the cord pattern or cord impressed or imprinted pottery, we call it Jomon culture. Historians call it Jomon culture, 8,000 BC. Let's see further. Now, in about from this period, 10,000 to 300 BC, this is a long period for this Jomon culture. That's where Jomon culture, lived. It was a Neolithic stage, yes, no question about that. People still, doing hunting, fishing, and producing pottery, which meant they had to preserve the food and food-growing people. But there is a question mark. The food that the people were growing, were they growing the food like settled agricultural people or not? So that there is that question mark, because for the settled agriculture, that means that you have to produce the food on a huge, big, massive scale, and for a huge, big number of people for a longer duration. So that is called settled agriculture, where people they settle in one place and they live there, and then from those early Neolithic or agriculture settlements, we produce cultures, villages, and these villages later on turned into huge big cities. This is the same pattern and design in history or civilization that we saw in Mesopotamia. We know about that in Egypt, also in India, as well as in China. So this type of a settled agriculture later on produces a fully developed civilization. But that is the reason, the question mark is there, because Japan did not produce a fully blown up civilization at that age of between 10,000 and 300 BC. By 300 BC, believe it or not, some civilization like that of Indian civilization or the Indus Valley civilization had disappeared completely, but the Japanese were just starting to rise in culture and later on in civilization. That's what the question mark is. Let's see further. Ancient Japan. The Jomon culture people, as I said, from 8,000 to 3,000 BC, they used, stone tools, but that's the early period. That they because it was a Neolithic age, they used stones. But at the same time, they produced, beautifully carved, these figurines. And so that shows that there were, group of people who were non-agriculture people, artisans, workers, that they would produce religious items like these. There is a dispute if this, figurine is that of a woman, female, or male. Some believe that, that figurine is that of a female. And why a female, we don't know. But because there is so much reverence, in the early ancient history for the sun goddess, and there were empresses and princes in Japan, that could be possible that it is a little bit, distorted, figurine of a female. Could she be, a princess or just a representation of a goddess? We really do not know. But the fact that it comes from the Jomon culture, that is the most amazing thing, because Jomon culture itself, by 300 BC, it gets into something very bigger and very impressive. Let's see. Still Jomon culture, a few items. Pot and some figurine and some container right here, and another container, pot, but they may seem crude, but then we get to 300 BC, they become very beautiful, unbelievably beautiful. Let's see. There is a big jump from the Jomon period to Yayoi culture, as we would see it. And the Yayoi culture, definitely it was a settled agricultural stage in the history of Japan. So From Jamon stone culture, which was from 10,000 to 300 BC, there is this big jump to Yayoi culture, which period is from 300 BC to 300 AD. And that is, a big jump in the sense that during this period, the Yayoi period from 300 BC to 300 AD, boy, you get a lot of stuff. It's just unbelievable. There you get agricultural revolution, bumper crops, almost anywhere, especially in the Yamato plains that people live. By this time, they know everything, about agriculture, and as well as animal husbandry. So that's why, it's a fully blown culture. The use of bronze and iron, again, unbelievable that at this stage they could get, bronze and iron, and all this happening, very suddenly and simultaneously. And the question is, what went not wrong but right? Why these people who did not know how to do agriculture, they were living in Stone Age, and all of a sudden you get bronze and iron, and fully grown agricultural activity. How that could be possible, and all of a sudden and simultaneously they get everything. Well, the reason is, this is what happened in the United States, in the 13 colonies. The people who made all this stuff possible in Japan, these were not the native people of Japan. These were from outside, Chinese and Koreans, who already had all this stuff. And so they came in and gave the people of Japan everything that they had developed, through thousands and thousands of years. That's how the American civilization started. America, huge big country, land. And so those people who came to the United States, early 1600s, Massachusetts area, East Coast area, New England, they brought their fully developed culture civilizations. They knew how to make things, how to create things. So when they came, the Englishmen, German, Dutch, whoever came from Europe, they already brought their civilizations, their cultures, their technologies, and all of a sudden, on the East Coast and American, soil, they created, the replica of European civilization, European culture. So these Americans who came in, from outside, from Europe, they did not have to invent the wheel. By this time, they had been doing so many things already. So they didn't have to invent the wheel. They did not have to start from scratch, just like in other civilizations people did. They brought everything from Europe and started doing things. And that's what happened in the Yayoi culture. Let's see what happened. The Yayoi culture, as I said, it runs from 300 BC to 300 AD, and the Korean immigrants, they came. There is a sort of a disagreement whether they came in huge big numbers or small numbers. I believe they became in big numbers, but most Japanese believe no, they became in small numbers. I tend to somehow agree with those who say no, they had to come in big numbers to make such a huge big difference. And this Yayoi culture from 300 BC to 300 AD is also called the first turning point in the history of Japan. There is a second one coming up later on, another section, and there is a third one that we will talk about it later on. But this, keep in mind, this is from 300 BC to 300 AD. The Yayoi culture is talked about as the first major turning point in the history of Japan. And that is when the Koreans came in big waves, big numbers, and they brought Korean technology that they had developed in Korea, thousands and thousands years back in history. And so the Korean technology was brought, 1,000 years old technology was brought to Japan by the Koreans. And these Koreans mixed up with the Jamon people, with the early people that were living in the islands and close to Tsushima Straits, especially because that place is very close to Japan as we would see it now. So there is Korea and there is Japan, and in between the two there is a strait running between the two, not to separate them but to unite them, and there is the Strait of Tsushima. and which plays a major role, and this is the place also here, made it possible. So this Tsushima Strait, rather than separating the two nations, it worked like a bridge between the two nations. And this is, just like a place in Europe, you have it between England and France, the channel as they call it. So this is sort of the channel or the strait between Korea and Japan, and played a major role in the history of Japan, because Koreans, they came to Japan through the straits, and that is why civilization, in fact, or the rise of the culture was in the southwestern part of Japan, and from there it would move further, further north to Hokkaido. But you have to wait for that, so that more and more Koreans would come. So these Koreans, they came from from Korea, but they brought also Chinese technology that had come to Korea centuries or generations before. So the Koreans, they would go east to Japan, and one reason for that was the Koreans could not go west, because west was China, and already China big population. So for the Koreans to come to Japan, this was like an empty space, empty place, a lot of land for the Koreans to go and settle it and call it home. And later on, these Koreans would become the modern day Japanese people. Let's see further. This Yayoi culture, it spread, as I said, from Korea to southwestern part of Japan, and would produce further civilization in the Kyushu and Honshu islands. That is the two southern islands. It produced very refined pottery. This is an early version of that pottery, but they're more beautiful and stunning pieces which we could not get because of all these copyright problems. So this is safe, so that's why we picked it up. But this, by 300 BC, AD, they were doing almost anything. Rice agriculture, very fine agriculture by this time, and some of it already terraced agriculture. The use of bronze and iron instruments very, massively, so that shows us that, civilization was booming in that part of the world. All right, still we are in the Yayoi culture. During this period, you see the rise of warfare, and of course for land. Arable or cultivatable land is small, as we noticed it, and water resources very precious. So that's why, because of the lack of land and lack of water resources, warfare was rather too much. It was this fact, just like in in the history or the civilization of Greece, because of lack of land and lack of natural resources, the Greeks, they were defined by warfare, as if this was, fighting was the Greeks' identity, and warfare was their daily business. So in Greece, limited piece of land, limited resources created tension in the society and warfare and violence in the society. Similarly in Japan, because of the lack of land and lack of natural resources, every piece of land, every resource that was there was worth to kill for and be killed for. And that is the reason in the early history of Japan you have a lot of violence among the Japanese. This would be Japanese against Japanese, local people fighting with another group of people in the near vicinity, and raiding each other and killing each other, only to take their land, only to take their natural resources or food resources. And so this gave birth to a military class, which you don't see in, there was always armies and militaries everywhere, but the military becoming a class of itself, just like you had it, the knights class in England, you have it right here in Japan also, a military class that later on would become defined as the samurai class. Let's see. So staying in the Yayoi culture, during this period, coming close to about 300 AD, the later part, people, they started living away from the farms. First, they used to stay close to the farms, their communities, their villages, but as people would take their food, they would also, kill them. So they decided, I think they became smart, to stay away from the, theater of war, which were the fields and the farms, and so they would live, away from the farming area, so that they would be at least safe. And if they saw some people raiding and coming, they could easily run away or do something, about it. That's why the peasant communities would stay away from the farming area. Early warfare, that was a good thing, that by 300 and 400 AD, as we go into 500, you see that early warfare led to peace and the rise of peaceful regional tribal confederacies, which means that these people realized that we don't have to fight. And if somebody comes to fight to take our land and resources, we can stop them by getting together and make our own defense. So in any given area that the 3 or 4 or 5 communities, local communities or villages that were living and previously fighting against each other among themselves, they got united. And so that unity gave them strength against other people, but at the same time that unity gave them peace among themselves. So coming closer to 300, 400 and 500 AD, in the 5th and 6th century after Christ, you see much more people grouping together and living together. So that brought them together to around the idea of one God or one religious practice, one political institution, one political head. So that was good for those people who could group together. But unfortunately, what if somebody else invaded them? They couldn't do anything, but at least they could defend themselves in a better way. So that's what was happening in Japan at the time when you see the rise of this wonderful person, a queen in the history of Japan. Let's see. Queen Pemiko, or also called Himiko, pronounced as Himiko, as Pemiko. And she lived around 300 AD. We really do not know much about, because there was not much writing about her. But what we do know was that she was a shaman. That is, she was a priest. That she claimed that she could talk to the gods or to the spirits and get the answers. So she used magic or sorcery, if you call it. She was a mature adult woman, but remained unmarried. For whatever purpose, just like Queen Elizabeth, the virgin, queen. She also, Queen Pemiko, remained unmarried and virgin. She had the story, the legend is she had these thousands of women, but only one man as attendants. So these women would serve on her, and this one man would also serve her. And so the 1,000 women and one man attendants, the army of attendants that she had. So these people were the man and the women, they would surround her and serve her and do whatever she wanted to do. She lived later on in her life, when she became a little bit more powerful. She lived in a castle, and there people would come and pay their respect, as a homage. And they would revere her, but they would rarely look at her. And that was sort of, in early Japan. And later on, even, later, people would not look at the face of the emperor or the empress, not only in Japan, and even of shogun, not only in Japan, but also in China. So it was sort of taboo to look at the face of the emperor, or especially look at in the eyes of the emperor, that meant that there was this extreme reverence, extreme respect for the person, not to look directly at the face or into the eyes of the person, which meant that he was, of a higher, superior, and in this case also of a divine, status. So that's why they would not look at the empress or the empress or the king or the queen's face, out of respect and out of reverence. Different people do, things differently. Okay, let's see further. Queen Himiko or Pemiko. Both spells are right, with the P, with the H, and the pronunciation, Pemiko or Himiko, the same. She used spiritual and religious influences to create peace. That was great. She united people in confederacies, but she had to convince these people first that she had all the spiritual and religious power that she could talk to the kamis, to the gods, to the spirits. And whatever they wanted, she could get those things. For example, get rain for us. And she could become like a medium between the people and the spirits. So that, maybe whatever she wanted to do, it worked. She asked for rain and there was the rain. She asked for snow and there was the snow, that sort of a thing. So she had to convince people through her spiritual religious powers first. Once that credential, was established, then she became like a political ruler of the people by bringing them together and stopping them from warfare, stopping them from fighting against or among themselves. So that was good, and so she brought them into peace, but at the same time in a political unity. So, which is, in political terminology, we refer to it as confederacy, which is to protect themselves, keep themselves in peace, and do good things, for life, agriculture, and other activities. So, in her time, peace reigned supreme, warfare was down. And so less violence, less killing, and that's why, so many people in the historians of Japan, they appreciate this lady, that she could convince people of her spiritual powers and get them united into political union or confederacy. Let's see. Getting out of, she did belong to what is called this tomb culture. These tombs, they shaped and looked like keyholes. Right here on the right. I don't know how good you can see them, but they are these tombs, and they, from outside, they look like keyhole shape. And inside there, a person can walk into the tombs once you get into the entrance. So this is an entrance to the tomb, and there is a gentleman going into it. So that's why these tombs, very important because these were, let's see, these tombs, first they were patterned on Korean tombs. Definitely the Koreans brought this idea of creating these keyhole tombs because the Korean had it. And the Yayoi culture, the previous culture, also had it. In the beginning of Yayoi culture, there were the tombs. The Japanese used it, the Koreans used it, but you had to be a big, powerful person or belonging to sort of a royal family or the leadership family. So these tombs were used, or graves were used, like burial chambers that contained mirrors, jewelry, armor, swords, horse trappings, utensils, jewelry. So these were made for, in fact, the leadership families, the higher aristocracy, the landlords or the rulers in the region, and whatever they owned in life, some of it, not everything of course, but some of it they would bring and bury it along with themselves. That leads people to believe that this tomb culture people at that time, at least, they believed in the hereafter. They believed that they would be using all these items after death. So they believed in life after death, so that's why they would have them. And it's not unique just only to Japan. You have the same thing in China, and especially on a huge, big, massive scale in the Egyptian civilization. The pharaohs, they took almost everything, gold, jewelry. Sometimes they would take their slaves, they would slaughter them, and bury them along with themselves as if they would need these slaves, in the hereafter. The Qin emperor, the first Qin emperor, Shi Huangdi, 2,000 years before Christ, I think he did a good thing because he, rather than slaughtering people, which I also did, but he created this terracotta soldiers, soldiers made out of clay. So that was good, that these clay people would come into life and fight for him in the life after death. We will see that. So this sort of belief also existed in Japan. So the good thing from the graves, these the keyhole tombs, was that we get a lot of material which otherwise would have been lost, destroyed, as so many things, items have destroyed, been destroyed from that period, but these were preserved in the tombs, and that's why we can say easily that this culture produced these items, and some of them very beautiful, stunningly beautiful. Let's see. Religion of Japan. We see a religion that later on would become known as Shinto, or the way of the gods. Now, is Shinto, the religion of Japan, is that a religion? Up until about 1960s, major writers of religion, they did not consider Shinto as a religion. Why? Because for a religion, the religious scholars believed you had to have two things. Number one, you have to have a moral code, a morality that would tell you, this is good, do this is bad, don't do this, stay away from it. Like the Ten Commandments, it tells us, don't do this and do that. So you have to have a moral code. Shinto did not have a moral code that would tell people this is good, do, this is bad, don't do. So it's not that type of a religion. Number two, for a system to be called religion, you have to have a system of reward and punishment, the consequences of human actions. If somebody does good thing, he or she would be rewarded. If somebody does bad things, they would be punished. So the concept of hell and heaven, or the concept of the consequences of human actions, that makes a system religion. Otherwise, it could be spirituality, a belief in a god, or a belief in a totem, or a belief in a spirit. We won't call it religion. And so that was also the case with Shinto. Nobody called it religion, but because of the growing economic power, technology, automobile, and all that, now more and more people refer to Shintoism as religion, and so they accept it, with or without, the moral code or the consequences. People now, they write about it, Shinto, as a religion. Let's see what is Shintoism or Shinto. Number one, it is animistic, polytheistic religion. Animistic in the sense, animism, it means that every object in universe has a life. And polytheistic because it has a lot of kamis or gods or spirits. It is basically a sort of a worship of nature, because nature itself becomes a divine being. And natural objects, sun, moon, rivers, mountains, they become divine objects. And all these natural objects, they have their own kamis, spirits, but not gods. Not gods in the sense like Islam, Judaism, Christianity. These are just spirits, kamis, and millions of them. By one count, around, more than 8 million kamis there are. These are supernatural beings, unseen beings, and so sometimes their presence is referred to them as the presence of a kami. Kami, they live in nature, especially beautiful places like Mount Fuji. You have a kami there, and the mountain itself, it's so beautiful, unbelievable, like a cone. And so this is Mount Fuji. These are the boats, and these boats are covered with snow, so they look like, like a flower or petals, something. My producer called it bananas, because there is a yellow thing on it also here. So, there is a lake, in between these boats and the cone-like Fuji. So it's so beautiful, so that's why it has a kami. One professor of Shinto, I talked to him, a Japanese gentleman. I asked him if everything has a kami. He said, yeah, everything that can influence your mind, you are awed, overwhelmed by the beauty of it, and you say, wow. So definitely that thing has a kami, even if it's a human-made object. Or it repulses you, a bad thing, you watch something, it scares you. And you don't want to go near it, like a volcanic activity. Yes, that also has a kami, and that's why, in Hawaiian religion we have Pele. The volcanic activity is associated with a goddess, Pele. And so he said, yes, that would have. I asked him if I like a beautiful Toyota and Mercedes or Honda. He said, yes, they also have a kami, so that's why you like it. You are attracted to it. So there you have it. And so natural objects, they have beautiful shapes of a tree, beautiful or overwhelming type of a rock, mountain, river, they would have kamis. Let's see further. So kami, they live in nature there, Mount Fuji. And the places that are believed to have kamis, if one can, they would rather have a Shimenawa rope. This is a hefty rope, big like, my arm. And let's see if we have it. Yeah, there is. So this place is sacred. This is the abode of a kami, a shrine or a cave. And so there is the rope Shimenawa right there, and some of it hanging right there. So this is, a place of reverence, of worship, and so an abode of kami. There's another one. This is the hefty one. I think it's much more like my, the size of a human being, right there. And there's one hanging. So that wherever in Japan, when you see a Shimenawa rope, hanging or there, that means it's a spiritual place. So you pay rather good respect to it. Do not show disrespect to the place. If some people take off the shoes, then you should take off the shoes. Don't just walk into it. So that's why it Shimenawa refers to the reverence of the place, and it has a kami. It has a spirit. Most Shinto shrine would have their these Shimenawa ropes. Let's see further. Staying with Shinto, it is, as I said, non-ethical. It does not tell you this is good, do this, and this is bad, don't do this. So it's non-ethical religion or spirituality. Different clans in the history of Japan, they claim that they belong to the kamis, or their ancestors. They were from kamis, or these kamis became their ancestors, or the ancestor were kamis. So they trace their family tree to one kami or another kami, not anymore, but they used to. And so the Yamato people, they believe that Amaterasu, that was not only just the kami of Yamato plains, but that was also the kami of the ruling elites that lived there and ruled there. So the Yamato leaders would refer to Amaterasu, a sun goddess, as their ancestor or ancestress. So the kamis, these are like superhuman beings deified. Nature is deified, and so there is Amaterasu coming out of the cave because there was a fight, and she went into a cave. She went into a cave and would not come. And just like we know, in the beginning there was darkness. So in the Japanese history or story of Genesis, the Japanese Genesis, there was darkness, in the world. And so she had to be begged, and they had to do these other kamis and people, especially kamis, they had to do so many things to get her, lure her out of the cave, and then they shut the cave with this hefty Shimenawa. And so she would not go back into it. And that's how she is the goddess of sun, and the sun would not go back again into the cave. And so there would not be this eternal eternal darkness that used to be. And so they brought her, lured her out of the cave, and there we have it, the sun. And because of that, this is, the sun goddess, and hence the reference to Japan as the place of the rising sun. So think about it, if she had just stayed there forever in the cave, it would have been, like eternal darkness. That's what the Japanese, believe. And so she brought life, to earth by coming out of the cave. And so Amaterasu, very important person. She would be claimed as the, person of the ancestor of all the Japanese ruling classes, and especially the royal class. The royalty in Japan, the kings, and queens of Japan, they would trace their family tree directly to Amaterasu. And some people believe that this is the, the unending family tree in world history, which is true. Whether there was a kami Amaterasu or not, sun goddess, that's, we would see that. But just the fact that human beings, for thousands and thousands of years, they can, go back, to their ancestors and finally to that cave, that point to Amaterasu that he was their ancestors. That's amazing. There was also this fact gave the Japanese ruling classes, especially the royalty sort of divinity. And because of her, she was the ancestor of the royal house, the royalty was considered as divine beings. So human beings in Japan also, were deified, believed to be gods, because they came from the gods. And so we would see this role and the power of the Emperor of Japan and the reverence and respect that he commanded from the people of Japan is just unbelievable. In other cultures and civilizations and countries and states, people, say bad things about their emperors, kings and queens, but not in Japan. And that is because the divine reverence that they believe is attached to the Japanese emperors. So that was the first, session 23, the first section of the Japanese history. We would follow this with another one. So let's see what we did today. In conclusion, we talked about the islands of Japan, the geography of Japan. We talked about the Yamato people, the Ainu, the Koreans, and how they came together to give us the people of Japan. We talked about the first period, the Jomon period that stretched forever, and then the Yayoi culture from about 380 to 300 BC to 380. We also talked about the tomb culture in the Yamato plains and how the tomb culture, contained all these great stuff. Queen Pemiko, we talked about this lady, shaman, how she brought people together, and the Shinto religion. So, and how this religion would play a big role in the history of Japan. And so we would talk about, refer to these people again and again as we go further in the, other sessions on Japan. And that's the end of today's session, session 23 on ancient Japan. And thank you very much for tuning in. Aloha.